from 1986 until now, we have both had the privilege and fortune to keep going.
Yeah.
And what a gift and a blessing that is.
Yeah.
At 7 years old, Drew Barrymore was the most famous child in America. Steven Spielberg had just introduced her to the entire world in E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial, and the planet fell in love with her instantly. But nobody was watching what was happening behind the scenes. By 9, she was being taken to nightclubs by her own mother. By 12, she had a substance habit. By 13, she was locked inside a psychiatric institution with barbed wire on the walls, convinced she was never getting out. This is not the story of a girl who simply lost her way. This is the story of how deep the fall actually was, and the one moment on the back of a motorcycle that reminded her what being alive was supposed to feel like. The institution that swallowed a 13-year-old whole. Most people know Drew Barrymore as the woman who rebuilt herself into one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. What gets skipped over is exactly how close she came to never getting that chance. At 13 years old, her mother drove her to a psychiatric institution in the middle of the night, walked her through 2 heavy doors, and left. No warning, no real goodbye. Just those doors closing behind her while Drew stood on the other side of them, alone. She has described that moment as one of the most terrifying of her life. Not because of what the place looked like, but because of what those doors meant. When you went through them, you did not come back out on your own terms. That was the rule. That was the reality. The facility was not a soft landing. It was a full psychiatric unit with barbed wire on the perimeter, padded rooms for patients who acted out, and stretcher restraints for anyone who pushed too far. Drew pushed. She kicked. She screamed at staff. She stirred up the other girls in her unit, rallying them against the rules, against the authority, against the entire structure of the place. And every time she did, the response was the same. Padded room, restraints, isolation. She spent 1.5 years inside those walls. Her mother visited occasionally. That word, occasionally, is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. For the better part of 18 months, Drew Barrymore was essentially alone in a psychiatric institution before she was old enough to have a driver's license. What on earth happened to get a 13-year-old girl to that point? Because the institution was not the beginning of the story. It was the result of everything that had been building since she was barely old enough to remember her own childhood. And that story starts not with Drew making bad choices, but with the adults around her making choices for her. The mother who took her daughter clubbing instead of to school. Drew Barrymore was born in 1975 into a family with one of the oldest legacies in American entertainment. The Barrymore name went back generations, connecting her to a lineage of celebrated stage and screen performers that the entire industry recognized and respected. But legacy has a shadow side. Her grandfather, the silent film star John Barrymore, died in 1942 at 60 from complications tied to years of heavy drinking. His daughter, Drew's Aunt Diana Barrymore, died from a substance overdose in 1960. Drew's own father, John Drew Barrymore, was a violent alcoholic who physically abused her mother, Jade, before the two divorced when Drew was 9. The pattern was already written in the family history. Drew was just the next chapter. After the divorce, Jade Barrymore became something between a stage mother and a party companion. She began taking Drew, 9 years old, to Studio 54 in New York, sometimes as often as 5 times a week. Studio 54 in the early 1980s was not a place for children in any interpretation of that phrase. It was the most famous adult nightclub in the world, known for a culture of open excess that included virtually everything a child psychologist would list as harmful. Jade brought her daughter anyway. Drew later wrote in her autobiography, Little Girl Lost, published in 1990, that Studio 54 felt like Disneyland for adults, except she got to be part of it. That line sounds almost fond in the retelling. It was not a fond situation. Drew started drinking alcohol at 9, the same year the Studio 54 visits began. She was using substance regularly by 10. Substance entered the picture by 12. This was not a teenager experimenting in secret. This was a child whose primary caregiver was modeling adult nightlife as normal and then leaving her to figure out the consequences on her own. Jade's approach to parenting, by her own daughter's account, was essentially to let Drew go her own way while Jade went hers. 2 separate lives, one of them belonging to a child who was being treated as an adult in all the ways that benefit the adult, and none of the ways that protect the child. What fame did to a 7-year-old who had nobody watching the door. Step back even further, and the picture gets more complicated. Drew Barrymore was working before she could walk properly. Her first commercial appearance came at 11 months old. She was in television spots before she started school. By the time Spielberg cast her in E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial in 1982, she was 7 years old and already a professional with years of set experience behind her. When the film came out and became the highest-grossing movie of its time, Drew became a genuine global phenomenon overnight. What does that do to a 7-year-old? It removes her from any possibility of a normal childhood. It puts her in rooms full of adults where the currency is attention and performance. It makes her feel most at home on a film set, surrounded by temporary families of cast and crew who treat her like a small adult and deeply uncomfortable everywhere else. Drew has said this directly, that she felt more real on a set than anywhere in her actual life, because sets gave her the structure and the belonging that her home life never consistently provided. She asked Spielberg during the filming of E.T. if he would be her godfather. He said yes. That detail is not a cute Hollywood anecdote. It is a 7-year-old girl on a movie set asking her director to fill a role that nobody at home was filling. By the time she was appearing at Hollywood parties and clubs alongside her mother at 9 and 10, she wasn't some clueless kid who stumbled into a bad environment. She was a child who had already learned that adult spaces were where she got the attention and the sense of belonging she needed. The clubs and the parties felt familiar in the same way the film sets had. The difference was that film sets had someone in charge who cared whether she showed up the next morning. The clubs did not. The moment everything broke open at once. By 13, the weight of all of it had become impossible to carry quietly. Drew was drinking heavily, using substance regularly, and carrying the emotional wreckage of growing up in a household where her primary parent functioned more like a social companion. Her father had been out of the picture for years, unreliable, and consumed by his own addiction. The family name that was supposed to be a legacy felt more like a curse from the inside. Multiple attempts to self-destruct in ways that frightened even the people around her eventually forced Jade to do the one thing she had avoided doing for years: take decisive action. The decision to commit Drew to a psychiatric institution was her mother's last available option after rehab had already been attempted at 13 and had not held. The facility where Drew spent a year and a half was a serious, structured psychiatric unit, not a celebrity wellness retreat. It had rules enforced by professionals who did not make exceptions for childhood stardom. She wasn't Drew Barrymore, the actress there. She was a patient. When she acted out, she faced the same consequences as every other patient. Padded room, restraints, no negotiation. She has spoken about how much she resented having her freedom removed and how convinced she was in those early months that the place was going to destroy her rather than help her. What actually happened was different. The structure she had been missing her entire life was finally present and consistent. The therapy sessions forced her to sit with things she had been running from since childhood. She has said she came out of that facility a fundamentally humbler person, quieter, more grounded, more capable of being present in a way the partying and the chaos had never allowed. The institution suggested, when her time there was ending, that Drew would have a better chance of real stability if she legally separated from her mother. At 14 years old, Drew Barrymore filed for legal emancipation from her parents, becoming her own legal guardian, while most of her peers were still asking permission to stay out past 10. The blacklist that nobody talks about when they tell her story. Here is the part of Drew Barrymore's story that the feel-good version always rushes past. Getting out of the institution and getting clean was not the beginning of a comeback. It was the beginning of several years of near-total professional exile. Casting directors knew where she had been. The entertainment industry in the late 1980s was not known for its compassion toward young women with documented histories of addiction and psychiatric hospitalization. She went to auditions. People who recognized her sometimes laughed, not at something funny, at the idea that she thought she was employable. She has described walking into rooms where her very presence was treated as a punchline. She had been one of the most recognizable child performers in the world at 7. By 14, she was unemployable by the standards of the industry that had built her up. That is not a gradual fall. That is a cliff. She spent years in that in-between space, too old to be the child star who charmed the world in E.T., too damaged by reputation to be trusted with real roles, too young to have figured out what came next. She was a 14-year-old legal adult with no family safety net, no steady income, and a resume that stopped impressing people the moment they found out what came after it. Now here is where the story turns. Because while all of that was happening, a connection she had made years earlier was still quietly present. And it showed up in one of the simplest, most unexpected ways possible. Stay with that, because this matters even more. The motorcycle ride that Drew never forgot. In 1986, before the institution, before the emancipation, before the blacklist, 10-year-old Drew Barrymore was on the set of a made-for-television Christmas film called Babes in Toyland. One of her co-stars was a 21-year-old actor named Keanu Reeves, still years away from the fame that Speed and The Matrix would bring him, but already carrying the specific quality that everyone who has ever worked with him tends to describe the same way. Grounded, genuinely kind, present in a way that doesn't perform itself. Drew was 10. Keanu was 21. They were not equals on that set in any obvious sense, but Reeves treated her with the same straightforward decency he extended to everyone around him. And that made an impression on a child who was being taken to adult nightclubs by her mother on weekends. When you grow up without consistent kindness from the adults in your life, you remember the ones who offered it without agenda. Then came her 16th birthday. Drew was at a club, the kind of environment that had been her normal social setting since she was 9, and Keanu Reeves walked in. She has told this story herself on her own talk show, with Reeves sitting across from her decades later. He came in, found her, took her hand, walked her outside, and put her on his motorcycle. They rode down 3rd Street in Los Angeles at what Drew has described as the warp speed of her life. No agenda, no lesson, just speed and open air, and the specific feeling of being completely free from everything pressing down on her. When he dropped her back at the club, she went back inside skipping. She has said, looking back, that she could not have designed a better moment for her 16th birthday if she had tried. Not because of the motorcycle specifically, but because in a period of her life when everything felt like a wall closing in, someone she trusted pulled her outside and gave her a few minutes of pure, uncomplicated freedom. Reeves, when she told him this story on the show, could not specifically recall the night, but he smiled through the whole thing. That detail matters too. The woman who built everything she was never given. The comeback Drew Barrymore built was not handed to her, and it was not fast. The slow trickle of small roles in the late 1980s and very early 90s gradually opened back up as enough time passed and enough people were willing to take a chance. Poison Ivy in 1992 was a genuine turning point, a film that let her play something far more complex than the innocent child the world had met in E.T., and it found its audience on cable and home video, even after a quiet theatrical release that brought in less than $2 million at the box office. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January of that year and earned a nomination for the Grand Jury Prize. It was the kind of small, unexpected validation that told her the door was still cracked open, even if it wasn't swinging wide yet. Doppelganger followed. Then the role in Wayne's World 2. Then Boys on the Side and Batman Forever. Each one small. Each one a brick. She was also doing something during those years that most people in her position don't do. She was showing up without ego. She has said herself that she accepted auditions where casting directors openly doubted why she was even in the room. And she went anyway, without complaint, because she understood that the only way back was through and not around. That kind of humility doesn't come from nowhere. It came directly from 18 months in a psychiatric unit where nobody cared what your last box office number was. The real shift came in the mid-90s when she made a deliberate decision to stop waiting for Hollywood to decide she was worth trusting and start building something herself. At 19, she founded Flower Films, a production company she ran out of her own living room. The first poster went up on the wall of that living room. She has shown it on camera. That company went on to produce some of the most commercially successful films of her career, including The Wedding Singer in 1998 and Charlie's Angels in 2000, which grossed over $264 million worldwide. She was not just an actress recovering from a bad reputation. She was a producer, shaping what got made and how it got made, on her own terms with her name on the door. She has said that what she wanted to make were films about the rawness of growing up, the vulnerability that everybody goes through but most people are too embarrassed to put on screen. That instinct came directly from her own story. You do not survive what she survived and then make sanitized entertainment about perfect people. You make things that are honest because dishonesty is what nearly buried you the first time. Her talk show, launched in 2020, became an extension of that same philosophy. Hard conversations made accessible, genuine emotion without performance. The scarred person who made it through, talking to other people who are in the middle of making it through. Her daughters, Olive and Frankie, born during her marriage to Will Kopelman, which ended in divorce in 2016, became the anchor for everything she built in her personal life. She had said before she became a mother that she knew with complete certainty she would not repeat what had been done to her, that she would never put a child in circumstances meant for adults, that she would be present in the way nobody had been present for her. By all accounts, she kept that promise. The girl who was taken to Studio 54 at 9 became the mother who fought to give her children the ordinary, protected childhood she never had. Cameron Diaz, one of her closest friends, once said that most people cannot even comprehend how hard it was to be Drew as a child, and that what she did by coming out the other side intact was nothing short of saving herself. That's the accurate summary of the whole story in one sentence. Keanu Reeves, for his part, has gone on to become one of the most genuinely admired figures in Hollywood, not primarily for any single role, but for decades of consistent accounts from co-stars and crew members that he shows up the same way every time. Thoughtful, generous, quietly decent. The person Drew encountered on that set in 1986, and again on her 16th birthday on 3rd Street, was not a performance. It was just who he was. And sometimes, who someone is, in the right moment, at the right speed, is exactly enough. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.